Now, there were days we nearly sold, with frost and then a drought, easier ways to make a quid would sort the young ones out. They say it builds your character, good women and good men, who turned around when the crop has failed and sow it all again. Chapter 10. Easier Ways to Make a Quid. It so happened that my Mallee mate, Murray Collins, who I'd met at a Presbo Fellowship Association in Boort, can you imagine, also wanted to move to Melbourne. We rented a little house in Camberwell, which we called the Haystack. I'm not sure why now. Probably because we were hayseeds. It was a 2-bedroom weatherboard place owned by a fellow who was willing to mow the lawns for us. At one stage, we could hear footsteps down the hallway at night and thought it was haunted. However, being country lads, we weren't easily fooled. We figured the noise was coming through the ground from a similar house next door. One night, Murray had a lady friend join us for dinner and we talked about the footsteps. She was a flamboyant actress type and leapt out of a chair and stomped up the hallway. "You mean like this?" she asked, mockingly. Murray and I quickly grabbed the opportunity to disappear into thin air. By the time she returned, the table was unattended, 3 fresh meals were left steaming, and a weird silence pervaded. We hid long enough for the lady to become quite shaken. When we reappeared from our hiding places, she said, "You bastards," in a tone that had some sense of relief. During the year I spent in Melbourne, after the release of Old Man Emu, I traded in my E.H. Holden for a little Fiat that looked like a stretched beetle. It was gutless, but fine for running around Melbourne. Murray was ahead of me when it came to cars. He bought a second-hand Volvo for its safety value. That would influence my choice of cars in the future. One of the things I amused myself with in Camberwell was discovering the old furniture stores and antique shops. I became fond of old brass kerosene lamps and bought a few beauties. You don't see too many of them now. I kicked myself for not realising the potential of buying Australian-made collectibles. I've bought many things since, but they would have been dirt cheap in 1970. Old Australiana is now almost extinct in such shops. With Old Man Emu a #1 hit nationally, the requests came flooding in just to sing that song. I was driven around Brisbane one weekend by an overnight promoter and sang it at every live show. The Deltones were performing at a club in Redcliffe, a suburb in the Moreton Bay region of Brisbane, so I rocked up there, sang my hit song, and was driven like a maniac to 3 other live shows in one night. The driving that night was horrendous, speeding from one gig to the next. The promoter told me the next morning that his brakes had failed. I've been very arsey in my time. He was just one of the many fly-by-night promoters who capitalised on my hit. I toured Queensland for the well-known promoter Ivan Damon on the strength of that one song. The tour was a shocker. It was done with cheap vehicles and we stayed in pubs. My 40-minute set was mainly folk songs with a bit of comedy and hardly anyone turned up. I wasn't paid a cent. Ever since then, if I sense failure, it takes me back to those years of shonky promoters, but I was learning fast. Some of that years is a bit of a blur, but I remember being flown to Adelaide to perform on TV as well as do a live show. I was playing my 12-string Maton guitar at the time, the one I used for Old Man Emu. 12-string guitars have this habit of the high octave G breaking, and I was a bit savage on guitars. Halfway through my set in a pub in Adelaide, the damn G-string broke again. I couldn't carry on, so I just left the stage and changed the string while the local radio DJ bullshitted on to fill in. I haven't played 12-string guitars in my shows since. In fact, I loaned that original Old Man Emu 12-stringer to Maton to display in their Melbourne factory reception area. Another memorable night that year was in Hobart. Once again, it was just a small set finishing with Old Man Emu. The local DJ came out and introduced me as Frankie Davidson. Most of the mob realised his mistake, thank goodness. However, a fight broke out in the pub soon after I walked on stage. All I could say when it settled down was, "Welcome to ringside with the wrestlers, folks." I was already paying my dues and learning the tricks of the trade. Once I'd decided that showbiz was going to be my life, it was time to get an agent or a manager. a rotund, white-bearded fellow named Jim Berenson was recommended. Jim specialised in voiceover clients. He had a rich speaking voice himself and was very good at silly voices. He managed the Marlborough Man at the time, a Gippsland horse-riding cattleman. Jim gave me the chance to be a cigarette-smoking character too, like Tony Barber and Paul Hogan. But I'd just given up smoking and I wasn't about to promote the evil nicotine habit. I decided it wouldn't be good for my singing career. How insane have we been sucking smoke into our lungs? I remember old Fred Farrell, a fencing contractor in Quambatook. He lit one cigarette from another. I doubt that he carried matches. That's like living your whole life in a bushfire. Soon after, Jim handed over my career management to a younger fella who really didn't do much except hang around when I went on television. He had a very difficult stutter. I'll never forget when I sang a pathetic thing I wrote, I can't really call it a song, on the Channel 9 television show Happening 70. The presenter, Ross D. Wiley, asked him what song I was going to sing. My manager said, "Woo, woo, woo, wallaby." Not surprisingly, Ross announced the song as Wallaby, being aware of my manager's stutter. Unfortunately, the terrible song was called Woo Woo Wallaby. I hope the tapes are lost. At the time, it seemed obvious to try and write a sequel to Old Man Emu. But of course, another silly song about an Australian animal or bird was going to be an also-ran. That didn't stop me trying, though. As an aside, another Quambatook boy was a regular on Happening 70. Molly Meldrum. It didn't take me long to realise that Melbourne was a rock and roll town. At that time, 1971, there were no licensed clubs. There was the odd cabaret room like the Hilton, but very few outlets for entertainers. In contrast, the Sydney club scene was thriving. These clubs provided heaps of venues for comedians, dancers and jugglers, even bad ones. Just about every club put on weekend shows and had a resident band to back singers. Virtually 100% of vocalists sang hits of yesterday and today. Sydney seemed to be what I needed. I was a one-hit screamer, but I could entertain. I put medleys together of Roger Miller, Johnny Cash, a bit of John Denver, and threw in some folk songs I'd heard by Joan Baez and Pete Seeger. Old Man Emu was always the highlight of my show, and a silly old folk ballad called Chastity Belt. Whiskey in the Jar, an Irish song, always went over well. I even sang Please Release Me. My voice was higher back then, but I must admit I had to push it a bit to sing in John Denver's range. I was a huge fan of Roger Miller, a singer-songwriter with a sense of humour, with songs such as You Can't Roller Skate in a Buffalo Herd, but it was Dang Me that had a mouth guitar in it. I was lucky enough, after Old Man Emu was released, to meet Roger Miller with John Laws and actually spent a few hours in his room at the Hilton Hotel. I asked him how he came up with the idea of rip-rip-ripping along with his guitar, and he told me it was something he thought of on the spur of the moment in the studio. I was interested in what Roger had to say because I'd used a kind of mouth guitar on Old Man Emu. Once I'd recorded my first album, what next? Mum and Dad had both dreamed about careers as singers, so they could understand how I felt about wanting to pursue my songwriting and performing career. Brian Rangat recommended I capitalise on Old Man Emu for a year and then clear off back to the farm. He reckoned there were only a handful of people making a good living out of music back then. I guess he assumed I was doing all right farming. Maybe we were doing okay, but it was bloody hard work, and we'd had a heartbreaking drought and then a flood during the previous decade. So I ignored him. Well, a dingo came around one day, but a little da-da-da. Hey there, Emu, you want to play? But the emu was too smart for him, walked right up and kicked him in the shin. Well, the last time I saw Old Man Emu, he was chasing a female he knew. As he shot past, I heard him say, She can't fly, but I'm telling you, she can run the pants off a kangaroo. Well, there's a moral to this ditty. Thrush can sing, but he ain't pretty. Duck can swim, but he can't sing. Nor can the eagle on the wing. Emu can't fly, but I'm telling you, he can run the pants off a kangaroo. Well, the kookaburra laughed and he said, It's true. He'd run the pants off a kangaroo.